raise your hand if you hear me. All right. Wonderful. And there's still some people coming in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. We only have about 55 minutes, and we want to get as much as we can during this panel session moving forward. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great lunch break. That bag lunch was delicious. This afternoon, we're going to have 2 panel sessions, each for about 1 hour. Then we're going to have a coffee break from 3:30 to 4. Then we will hear Roshi Joy in Halifax about Buddhist practices of nonviolence. Then break at about 5, when you can go off to have dinner somewhere within Santa Fe. And then our closing panel will be ending the whole conference, this part of the conference at 7:30. So our first panel discussion for today is entitled Working to End War, Poverty, Environmental Destruction, and Violence, Building a New Culture of Peace and Nonviolence. And we have with us 5 leading activists, thinkers, writers, and organizers. You can read their full biographies in the program. I will introduce them all now in the order that they will speak. And then they will each speak for just about 5 minutes. Then we will have some time for question and answer. We will end at about 2:25 and have about a 5-minute stretch break before our next panel. So it's my absolute pleasure. I respect so greatly the panelists, and just grateful to God to be here right now to present these great panelists. So first we have Kathy Kelly. Kathy is a longtime activist, writer, speaker, and a coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. She has traveled to Afghanistan some 14 times since 2010 and is just back from Kabul, where she works with the Afghan Peace Volunteers. She has been nominated many times for the Nobel Peace Prize and joins us from Chicago, Illinois. And I hear some applause for Kathy. Thanks for being here, Kathy. Thanks for being here and the good work you're doing. Next, we will hear from Medea Benjamin. Medea, woo, yeah. Medea is another longtime advocate for peace and social justice. She is co-founder of Code Pink, as well as the international human rights organization Global Exchange. A prolific writer, speaker, and organizer, Medea lives in Washington, D.C. Medea, thanks for being here. Woo. Next, we have Sister Joan Brown from Albuquerque, a Catholic Franciscan sister and former staff with Pache Bene Nonviolent Service. Sister Joan has been a leading voice on behalf of the environment for many years. She serves as the director of New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light. Thank you, Sister Joan, for being here. Give her a hand. Finally, we welcome again Reverend James Lawson, who will close this panel and the next one and offer any insights, further insights he wishes to give on these topics of violence in light of his lifelong work with nonviolence. Please join me in introducing and welcoming Reverend Lawson, as well as all of our esteemed panelists. Woo! Okay, so we'll go ahead and get this jam session started. All right, Kathy.
Well, good afternoon. Surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, all the way from Imani and Anissa, our under 2-year-old guests today, to Reverend Lawson. It's a rare and a wonderful privilege to be here with you and together to be learning so much as we listen. And Jim Lawson, when you spoke about those successive campaigns, those civil rights campaigns that changed history, you changed world history. Not you alone, but in concert with so many other people, your actions echoed, they reverberated. People in Nicaragua carried Acote branches, they sang, nosotros venceremos. They said, we shall overcome. You went to Iraq and children sang to you, we shall overcome, in Arabic and in English. I heard women as the bombs exploded in Sarajevo, longing for their children in the trenches, in their own language and in English, sing the civil rights anthem. We can overcome poverty. We can feed a hungry world. We can eradicate disease. We can survive the catastrophes looming, the global warming, the climate change. We can do it, but we can't do it and still feed, still satiate the bloated, obscene, wicked Pentagon budget. My young friends in Afghanistan write the word enough on the palm of their hands. And it's their way of shouting to the world, enough, we've had enough of war. Blood will not wash away blood. There are some images that in my psyche I sort of have to file in the bin that says, be haunted by this image. But it takes me a long time to let that image even come to the surface. And so I'm going to ask you to indulge me as I share with you something I've grappled with. It's now 3 years. I happened to be home alone at the Border Free Center in Afghanistan, and most of the kids were either at school, these young teens, or they had fanned out going up the mountainsides, going to the refugee camps to try to assemble 2 lists. List number 1, women, many of them widows, who would manufacture the big, heavy, wool-stuffed blankets that become a matter of life and death for the people on list number 2, the people who live in squalid refugee camps and won't survive a rough winter without some means to protect them from the frigid cold. Well, last year they made 3,000 of the blankets, and there were 60 women from all 3 different tribes in Afghanistan working together. It's a brilliant project. Well, there was a racket, a banging on the door, and I thought, well, I must answer. Maybe it's, one of these youngsters. And as soon as I'd opened the door, even a crack, 2 women slipped through the door, and my heart sank, because they were women who wanted to be on the list. They wanted to make some money to feed their children. They had walked 3 hours to get there. Their children were starving. They had no access to water. Then the oldest showed me a festering sore on her ankle. No medicine, no care. And I knew that the list had already been finalized. There was no money. If I had given them money, the line would have circled over to the next neighborhood. And so the women did something which was as though they'd been at one of Ken Budigan's workshops. They sat down. I call them, and my friend Dr. Hakim in Afghanistan calls them the women who won't go away. And we say that with utter respect. It's the enterprising thing to do. The women who won't go away. One woman thumped her breast. She began to cry. But then she grabbed my hand, and then she stroked my hand, and she smiled because she knew I was useless but well-intended. The women who won't go away. Who can match their incredible resolve, their tenacity? My friends, it's tragic, but I'll tell you who. It's the generals who won't go away. The generals and the warlords and the bloated corporatocracies that insist on extending their long tentacles, controlling the resources that other people would consume, provoking new cold wars, spreading weapons all around the world. These generals who won't go away. And so our work becomes that of resolving that we will say enough, that we will work to abolish war, to end all wars. In the Black Lives Matter campaign, there's a very important poster. It says they wanted to bury us, but they did not understand that we are seeds. We are seeds. The military threatens us. The military's threat is that if you rock this boat, you might be the next one in the bread line. You might wipe out the jobs that you need. So many jobs are tied up in the military-industrial complex. Now so many jobs tied up in the prison-industrial complex. I was before a judge recently before going to prison for 3 months. The military prosecutor said, "Your Honor, Miss Kelly is in grave need of rehabilitation." Good luck. Well, I am. And I needed the rehabilitation of going back into the prison so that I could be next to somebody else who had 8 numbers so that I could feel what it's like for women to be trapped in the prisons. I need to feel what it's like for people to be in the war zones. We need to gain the literacy to become literate in the stories of the people who are trapped and burdened by our wars, both the war against the poor at home and the war against others beyond. We need that literacy. And when the military says, we can take your job away, we have to seriously stop and ask ourselves, what kind of work is valid? It's not valid to work as a human zookeeper. It's not valid to train other people to shoot, to kill, to threaten, to dehumanize. It's also not valid to demonize. And so let us extend hands open, loving hands open to every person that comes back from a war zone, recalling that 22 combat veterans kill themselves every day. Hands open to every person who emerges from a prison. Ask Georgia Walker how to do it. Hands open to one another as we catch courage from one another to create that world wherein we say, choose life, that you and your descendants might live.
Thank you, Kathy Kelly, for such profound words. Medea Benjamin.
So I want to just say how honored I am to be with this panel, with this group. And in some ways, it seems like we are the group that recognized, unlike so many other people, that when Obama was elected to office, it didn't mean that that was the end of what we had to do. And when I look back at what happened to this big peace movement that we had under Bush, remember that? When we could get hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets. And now you see how difficult it is to get people out. That we are the core of the people who understand that this is not about who is in the White House and what political party is in power. This is about a fundamental movement to redo the economic base of this country that's based on the military-industrial complex, a movement that is to redo the way we vision our society. And I wanted to ask how many of you have participated in a Black Lives Matter rally, demonstration, vigil, something. So every hand should be up, because we should recognize that this is such a critical part of our movement. We are part of this movement, and we must show physically with our bodies that we are part of this movement. And when our group Code Pink went to Ferguson immediately and participated in the marches, the rallies, the vigil, we sat down, we said, what can we do as a women-led movement? And they said, bring the women, the mothers who have lost their children to police violence, bring them to Washington, D.C., get the meetings with the Justice Department, with the White House, with Congress, help them to reach the people that they have to reach. And we did that. We brought the women in. And it was an amazing experience. And one night while they were in D.C. at the Code Pink House, we sat around, and one of them said, do you know that the policeman who shot my son had just returned from Iraq? And I said, how many others of you have a story where the policeman returned from being overseas? And the hands went up one by one. Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq, Afghanistan. And they said, do you know that in the police departments, it's the veterans who are getting priority to join the police force? And these are people who have PTSD. These are people who are trigger happy. These are people who are shooting our sons in the street. And so there it was right before us, as if we needed it, direct connection between the wars overseas and the violence in our communities. And we continue to work with those mothers in the broader movement. And our piece of it is to push to end the Pentagon program that is dumping all this military gear into the police departments in our communities. That must stop. So, you know, one of the reasons that it's so hard to build a peace movement that focuses on the wars overseas is that most of the people in this country don't see those wars. We obviously don't have a draft, and so much of these wars are done covertly. And that's why some of us got involved in the program to expose the drone warfare, because that was the ultimate way, that and covert operations, to carry on wars and military interventions around the world behind the backs of the American people. What a brilliant way to do that, to allow people to be sitting in air-conditioned rooms and chairs, pressing buttons to kill people thousands of miles away. And you know, one of the reasons that they also have been getting away with it is racism that pervades our society, and racism that allows them to press a button to kill poor people of color. That is who's being killed. It's not white people being killed. It's not wealthy people being killed. It's poor people of color who are being killed with our drone strikes. So that's another example of how the racism at home and the racism abroad is so intertwined. And I want to thank so many of you who have participated in the drone protests and say that they have done so much to, one, expose a program that our government wouldn't even tell us about, change public opinion to be starting to be majority against the use of drones, force the government to recognize that we are killing innocent people, connect with the victims and their families overseas as we travel to meet with these people in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Yemen, and also to force our government to compensate these victims, which it refused to do, and to stop the slow down the proliferation overseas by making connections, a global movement focusing on this issue. But our work is certainly not done. It will only be done when we ground all the drones and stop the drone warfare. So I unfortunately don't have time, but I want to use my last remaining 2 minutes to say that raise your hand if you did something to try to stop the war in Iraq. Well, that looks like just about everybody in this room. Raise your hand if you're doing something now to try to stop a war in Iran. That is not everybody in the room, but it must be everybody in the room, because the very same people who drove us into the war in Iraq are now trying to drive us into a war with Iran, and we cannot let that happen. We only have a short period of time until Congress votes on September 17th. And right now, when we talk to our friends in Congress, they say in some of their offices, they are getting 10 calls against the deal for every one call in favor of this deal, and that must change. And that means that we are not doing enough, that we have to redouble, triple, quadruple our efforts. We have to call not only our own congresspeople and senators, but other ones in other states, because this is a national issue. So I really encourage you all to recognize that this is going to be the most important vote coming up in September that we have had since the vote on the war in Iraq. And we must all recognize it, we must all be involved in it, and we must all make sure that those people that drove us into a war that led to over 1 million Iraqis being killed and opened the doors for ISIL to be created, they must not be the ones that get the say on this Iran nuclear deal. We must get that deal. We must make it happen. We must applaud Obama on this one. And we must say that diplomacy works, that talking to our adversaries works, and that once this Iran deal passes, we want our government to go on to the next and the next and the next one to show that we as a people will not deal with conflicts through war, but through diplomacy and nonviolence. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea Benjamin. Next, Sister Joan Brown.
Thank you. And it's a privilege to be here in this place and with you this day. And blessings to all of you. I'd like to ask you a question. What do you love? What do you love so deeply that you are willing to sacrifice, to cherish, to work that might be cared for in the light of climate change? In the work that I do, I usually don't begin with the facts. Most of us know those facts, all the numbers and statistics about climate change and who's dying and which lands are being flooded and which island nations are already devastated. What I like to do is to call people to their own experience, to their own complicity, to their own hearts and what they're being called to do. Several years ago, I invited this among the people of New Mexico. And among the 1,000 responses I got, there was one that really touched me. I invited people to write a story or do a picture or something about what it is that they love, that they were going to work to protect. So I received this picture from a woman farmer in the southern part of the state during the height of the drought. And it was a picture of children, youth, playing volleyball in the Rio Grande. That means Grand River. It was sand. And she said, my farmer brother and I walked to the Rio Grande one Sunday, and the only water I saw were the tears in my own eyes. The tears in our own eyes are the voices of our hearts that beseech us to act now. They are the tears of our brothers and sisters suffering throughout this planet because of climate change. They are the tears that wake us up and tell us that climate change really is the issue of our moment. All of these other issues about war, conflict, hunger, drought, poverty, increasingly are related to climate change, and that will be the case. The Pentagon for the last 15 years has said climate change is the greatest national and international security threat of our time. Now, having said that, I'd like to say that climate change is not the problem. The unprecedented droughts, the typhoons, the hurricanes, the wildfires, the glacier melt, the sea level rise, the conflicts, which if we take the root of some of those, like Syria, are really related to environmental devastation, and the last 10 years that are the warmest in history, the problem is not climate change. No, the problem is not climate change when we look at the unprecedented numbers of immigrants and refugees for which there is no UN designation of climate change, And the UN just announced that we have reached the highest level of refugees in our current time, 60 million, which translates into 1 in every 122 human beings on the planet. Or if this were the country in the world, it would be the 24th largest country. No, the problem is not climate change. It is not climate change with the extinction of some 40% of our creatures that we have been given by God, beloved species, or whole generations that are living without hope and don't know what to do about this, or they just live in apathy. No, the problem is not climate change that I saw in the eyes of the people that I visited in Peru, in the Altiplano, where the glaciers are melted, they have no water for their farming, and yet the mining industries are taking the very last drops of water. Or the women that I have met from Bangladesh who are living in water. Or the women living in droughts in Uganda who just say, I want my life back. I want to know when to grow food. No, the problem is not climate crisis or climate change. The problem is a soul crisis. It is a problem, a crisis of the human heart. And what is required is a climate change of heart. What is required is that the sacred earth community needs to wake up to environmental degradation and climate disasters that are leading to greater hunger, poverty, increased destabilization, and conflicts. What is needed is a collective climate change of heart, a new worldview. Pope Francis, in his recent encyclical, Laudato Si, Praised Be, on care of our common home, not my common home, but our common home, says, the external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. For this reason, the ecological crisis is also a summons to profound interior conversion. Now, we need conversion of the Pentagon, we need conversion of our structures, but we need to look at our own hearts first and our own complicity. How am I part of that? And then move to the collective. Pope Francis continues to say, we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for the solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. So an integrated approach is what we need as we face climate injustices, the climate crisis of our own hearts, the climate crisis of our souls collectively as human species, as people in this country. So what can we do? Well, I have 3 suggestions. The first is we need to meditate. We need to pray. We need to reflect. We need to walk in wonder, in contemplative beauty of what we have been given of this planet that is all gift. And out of this sitting, walking, praying, we will be led to what we need to do in strong ways, not complacent ways. Second, we need to teach and educate and engage people about this concern. The papal encyclical is a wonderful tool I have just thrilled about. I did a Bible study 2 weeks ago, and all of these women in the Bible study, I was dealing with the encyclical, said, we had no idea. What can we do? We had no idea. How many people out there, you wonder, to me it's kind of amazing, but it is true, are saying, we did not know. What can we do? Practically, in our own lives, in our own homes, we can do all kinds of conservation. We can buy local food. We can grow food. I've just been canning tomatoes from our garden. We can do renewable energy. We can do solar. We could sign cards that I have here. Take the climate pledge, and these will go to Paris saying, I will reduce my consumption by 50% by 2030. See me if you want to sign that afterwards. 3, advocacy. And I mean deep advocacy at various levels, realizing that our civic life is our spiritual life in practice and embodied in this flesh and human body that I have been given as a gift. What am I doing with this one life that I've been given? It might mean divestment from fossil fuels who are the largest carbon producers at this moment, such as many Catholic women's religious communities are doing, or the United Church of Christ, the Unitarians, the Episcopalians, the World Church Council of Churches, and others have done. It could mean advocacy, working on support for the Green Climate Fund, an international fund that the United States still has not funded, for adaptation and mitigation for our brothers and sisters who are suffering most throughout this planet because of climate change. There are many numerous issues at the local and federal and state level that we can be involved in with that. So there are many things to do. The invitation, though, ultimately is that climate change of our souls, of our hearts, of our society. It means that we need to dig deeply and honestly into our personal collective lives to face what is it that we love that we are willing to sacrifice. And not point the other finger, but point the finger this way. See, how can I be in dialogue? How can I be a part of this change? Our words must become actions, and our actions must be spiritual practices of love as a verb. There's a popular saying of St. Francis of Assisi that often rings in my ear that I would like to close with, and it merely is, preach the gospel, and if you must, use words. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Joan Brown. We appreciate you. All right. Reverend Jim Lawson.
Well, again, it's good to be here and to participate in this national conference of Campaign Nonviolence. I'm still pleased that John and Ken have put this together, and it's a very excellent initiative and one that I support. I appreciate all the people on the platform this afternoon. They are activists of long standing, and I support largely from a distance the work that they have done and are continuing to do. Kathy, of course, is one with whom I've had contact in the past. We went to Iraq together. She led our group of clergy back, I don't remember when it was, but anyway, it was a great experience, great awareness. So I want to simply indicate the extent to which all of these issues are quite important. As I listened, but also as I've reflected upon this panel, I decided to try to lift up, if I can, 4 things. First of all, I want to remind you that we are talking around issues which, at least in me, confirms what people of faith and people of non-faith who want a different kind of country must come to understand, that the Isaiah, the Jesus of the 20th century for the 21st century, was Martin Luther King Jr. On April the 4th, 1967, exactly a year before his assassination, I sometimes say his crucifixion, King made his most important speech, which is largely ignored. But in that speech, King called for a revolution in America, a nonviolent, spiritual, moral, values-centered revolution, a revolution for people, on behalf of people, and on behalf of access for all. In that speech, he said that unless we can bring this revolution around, then 15, 20, 30 years from now, and he was speaking to clergy and laity united against Vietnam, an ecumenical gathering, packed standing room only house in Riverside Church in Harlem, New York. He said, unless we can bring about that, then this year we're marching against Vietnam. Next year we'll be marching against the war in South Africa, Guatemala, and he lists a number of other countries. And look and behold, how many wars have we had since 1967? Exactly. We need to take that with utter prophetic and theological seriousness. And that, among other things, speaks to me and says that the primary base for changing the world in which we live must be changing ourselves and our own nation. The culture, the politics, even the religious ethos of this land of ours. It seems to me that our work must center on how we get the United States government, and especially its big business allies. In fact, I might say the fact that our government today, our federal government, our national government, our White House, our Pentagon, our education departments, and so forth and so on, are battered by the Chamber of Commerce and groups like that who have fundamentally changed the nature of the political process in the United States. So the business entity, the economic, the plantation capitalism of America must be with a major target for economic, political, and social change. We need that revolution if we're going to change our world. And recognize that our United States government, with this historic experiment, the first of its kind, to say that we do not need the oppression of 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 years, oppression of top-down direction, that we the people are endowed with certain qualities, that we ourselves can govern ourselves together if we wish to do it. That historic, almost impossible beginning, we, it seems to me, have to understand that it has been sabotaged by the way in which we've had to compromise with all sorts of issues. And I don't deny that necessity, but I do insist that in this generation of ours, in the 21st century, we are encumbered and burdened by the reality that this wonderful land of ours, we, this 315 million people, are now governed by a very, very small number of institutions and people who have decided that the United States is to continue the empires of the Western civilization and be the #1 empire. This is one of the reasons why Europe never produces an alternate policy in international affairs, not since World War II, because those forces in those countries want this nation to be the empire that will govern the world. And of course, we in the United States say that the world is ours, and we own it, and people elsewhere must do as we say do. And no empire has reached the level of strength and power that we have. These people who are talking about a weak America, how can we talk about a weak America? Does this mean then our bases in more than 130 countries give us weakness and a strength? Does this mean that our naval fleets and air fleets and the thousands of atomic weapons that we have in place make us weak rather than strong? What are they talking about, weak America? No nation, no people have ever had bases around the world as our nation has. No nation has ever had armies and fleets of airplanes everywhere. No nation has had the economic strength that this nation has had across the last 100 years, especially, so that we can demand that Tanzania must produce tea as a cash crop, not produce its own society of agriculture and business so it can finance its own people, but it must produce tea to transfer to the United States and Europe and other places. The empire, we in the United States must recognize what we have become, against our will maybe, but not against some people's will, and we must create a culture that turns that upside down, or maybe it has to be said upside right, upside right. So king has to be heard. And then the last thing I will say is that about 3 years ago, I was startled on a Southwest flight to somewhere, Nashville or someplace, and I picked up its Spirit magazine, and in the Spirit magazine there was a story, an interview with Harrison Ford, the actor catapulted into fame in the movie industry through Star Wars, and Bill Ford, at that time chairman of the Ford Company, Motor Company. Both men have been with each other on a number of occasions across the earth and across the United States on environmental places and environmental issues. And Harrison Ford in this article says, and I'm quoting his exact words for the first sentence, he said, the environmental movement has failed. And he suggests that the reason it has failed is it's had too many issues, and it's focused on one species at a time. Then he suggests that the environmental movement must find a way to become a major confrontation with the society and with the nation. And he uses the term like the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Now, what I'm wanting to try to suggest to us is that to change the culture of our nation from violence to the incredible possibilities of compassion and love, from war to how a just society can better sustain the human species, from animosity and fear to security that is rooted in we, the people, ourselves. The change of that kind of a culture in that direction must require, in my judgment, a consensus strategy and a priority strategy. And I think for us to reach that in part is not conferences, but hard work at the local levels of our nation. That is with you, where you live, settling in with people there, settling in with a diverse group of people, Black, Hispanic, Pueblo, indigenous people, women especially, and seeking together how in that locality you can act to change the quality of life there. Out of that, I believe, we will find the strategy that can overthrow the principalities of power and powers that inundate us today.